But both calculators are technically correct. And technically correct is the best kind of correct.
Okay, Boomer.
I'm Tim with Subwoofer Tools, and we're going to talk about why my calculator makes boxes that are so much bigger or so much smaller than other calculators. I got a message from Facebook from Anthony, and he basically asked me, hey, when I use your calculator, the box is 26 inches deep. But when I used another calculator, the box was only 20 inches deep. Why is it different? And the answer to that is port area. And then he said, well, which one's correct? And I said, well, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I do know I did not say this and probably should have. But both calculators are technically correct. And technically correct is the best kind of correct if you're Homer Simpson. So that begs the question, how can both calculators be correct if the results are different? And the answer with that lies with how we determine port area. That's it. The box volume's the same, the port tuning is going to be the same, but my calculator produces a much larger port than the other calculator does because we use a different rule of thumb. We use different parameters to determine port area. And port area affects port length. And then, of course, that is also, when you have a large port area, you have a longer port length. And when you have a larger port area and longer port length, you get a larger port volume. We add port volume to our speaker's net volume, so that way we can maintain port tuning. So when you have a much larger port volume, you have a much larger gross volume. And if you have the same height and width, you're going to have a longer depth. And that's the long answer there to Anthony's question. Now, the rule of thumb from the other port calculator uses something very simple, and I've used it in the past to good effect. I've made a decent box with it, but you're looking at about 10 square inches of port per cubic foot of port area, and that's fine. You can do that if you want to maintain box size. If box size is more important than maintaining, linear airflow at high volumes, then that's great. That also works if you're trying to build something a little bit more generic. You want to make it for different drivers and you want to have, predictable performance. You want to make sure that this is always going to be 2 cubic foot tuned to 40 hertz, for example. You're going to have a 20 square inch port area, and off the top of my head, I don't know what the length of that is. I'm sorry, I don't have that formula memorized. It's a bit complicated. So the rule of thumb employed by Subwoofer Tools is different. It's a little bit more involved, and the earliest publication of this rule I can think of is in the Loudspeaker Design Cookbook from the 90s. We'll start off with just the woofer. We're going to take a look at the woofer's surface area, SD parameter. We're going to look at the linear excursion, or Xmax parameter. We're going to multiply those together and get kind of a max volume. That's how much air the woofer moves at full excursion. We will then multiply that by the tuning frequency of the box to get basically a number of volumes per second. Then we will take the square root of that to get surface area per second, if you will. Since the minimum port area that Subwoofer Tools calculated for Anthony's subwoofer versus the port area computed by the competing calculator was so much larger, the box ended up being so much larger. Basically, I used this rule of thumb that included the woofer's throw because I wanted to get something out the door. A minimum viable product. I had the formulas, but it was a lot more complicated than I was willing to do at that time. So now that I have the formulas and I have a little bit more time, I've got the Subwoofer Tools website up and running. Now it's time to start adding more features. I have a spreadsheet that I got from ScanSpeak's website. It's an XLS as opposed to an XLSX extension, which leads me to believe that this was last modified in the mid-90s before Excel 97. It says it's version 0.96, which kind of lends credence to that. It has a number of the formulas that you could find online to determine different aspects or different parameters of the woofer based on some very, very rudimentary measurements. And we can actually see how we can derive things like QTS and VAS out of simple measurements like the force factor of the motor assembly. That's pretty cool. So one of the computations that comes out of this spreadsheet is port velocity. There's a number of computations that have to be made before I get to the actual port velocity computation. It's several layers deep. There's about 90 different columns as we move across the spreadsheet to get to our goal of, air velocity coming out of the vent. And the whole goal right now is to maintain that the air velocity coming out of the vent is going to be 34.3 meters per second or slower. That way we don't have a lot of chuffing noises. We don't end up with compression. Alright, that wraps it up for this video. I want to thank you for your time. If you would like to, please check out subwoofer.tools. That would be awesome. I want you to go and design your subwoofer. Thank you.